All right, everybody, welcome to module number 9, Behavior Theory, Core Concepts. We are moving on to our next counseling approach, and it is this interesting old school approach called behavior theory. And we're going to spend, as we've been doing all semester, a couple of weeks this week talking about the core concepts, next week talking about a few examples of some applications, ways that we see this theory at work in the world around us. So one of the things I want to highlight for you is, again, many of you may already have taken a class with me called Behavior Modification, CMSW 1341. Some of you may take that class with me. And in that class, we spend an entire semester talking about two theories that we cover in this class, this theories class, the behavior theory and what's called cognitive behavior theory. We're going to talk about cognitive behavior theory, or CBT, here in a few weeks. But in the behavior mod class, we camp out around behavior theory and its cousin, cognitive behavior theory. So if you've already had the behavior theory class with me, or you're in it this semester, this week and next week, maybe a little bit of a review for you, because we're covering some of these core ideas that we get into a little bit more detail on in the behavior mod class. So kind of the idea, if you've ever taken a psychology class, you probably have kind of learned that one of the ways we sort of make sense of who we are as people from a field of psychology is this idea that we have different parts of us, right? We have our mind and we have our brain and our thinking, we have emotions and we have feelings and we have behavior. And so all of those parts, our brain, our mind, our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior, all compose and comprise who we are as people. But in a lot of ways, those are separate parts of us, so to speak. We have behavior, we have feelings, we have thinking. And we'll talk more about that with CBT here in a few weeks. And through the years, all these different helping approaches sometimes will kind of narrow and center and focus down on certain aspects of our being, of our human psychology. And that's true with behavior theory. Behavior theory, as its name implies, is interested in that behavioral part of us. This is a theory that has been developed and was developed many, many years ago that really focuses less on the internal experience of being a human, in other words, our thinking and our feelings, and it really focuses more on that outward observable behavior. And so this theory was developed in the generation after Sigmund Freud came along. And there were several theorists, B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, and Albert Bandura, some of those names maybe you've heard of before. Those theorists came along. All of them, interestingly, were trained in traditional Freudian psychotherapy. But they really kind of had a different way of looking at human beings and human behavior and human nature. And they really focused and developed a whole helping approach that's focused more on outward observable behavior and how we can use some concepts that we call behavior modification and behavior theory, human behavior, as a way to help people deal with issues and problems in their lives. We see behavior theory used today, especially with kids. If you're going to work with children or adolescents or and teenagers, you're going to use a lot of behavior mod and behavioral approaches. If you're going to work with people with intellectual disabilities or autism spectrum disorder or closed head injuries or traumatic brain injuries, or post-traumatic stress disorder, you're going to use a lot of behavioral approaches. If you do any kind of parent training or addictions counseling, addictions counseling uses all kinds of approaches, and but many times we use lots of what we call behavioral approaches in working with those populations. Mental health counseling as well too. So we see the effects of behavior theory and behavior modification all around us in social services, but we also see it all around us in our world today. We all know, we're all familiar with human behavior because all of us engage in behavior. So core ideas, let me summarize 3 or 4 core ideas that are in your lecture notes. And then again, you can read through those lecture notes as you get ready to do your discussion question and as you do your homework assignment. So number one of the core ideas that I kind of like about behavior theory is that behavior theory teaches, sort of opposite of Freud, that human behavior is not always mysterious. Freud kind of taught that, who knows why we do what we do? The mind is complicated, and the brain is complicated, and emotions are complicated, and who knows why people do what they do? That's kind of the Freudian idea. Well, the behavior theory idea says this: I bet we can figure it out. If you've ever asked yourself, I wonder why that person did that. Well, this approach says, I bet we can figure it out, because actually behavior is not mysterious. Behavior is observable. Behavior is measurable. Behavior at times, not always, is often predictable. We can understand it. Behavior has a context. And we don't need to walk around scratching our heads saying, well, I don't know why that person, I don't know why I do what I do. Well, this theory came along and said, well, let's figure it out. I bet we can look at your situation and look at you and look at the context in which your behavior occurred and the consequences that you experienced when you acted and what you did next. I bet we can kind of break it down. I bet we can figure out why you are doing what you are doing. So behavior is not always mysterious. It's observable, measurable, and sometimes predictable. Another way of saying it that I give you in your notes is that behavior makes sense. Behavior often makes sense when you look at behavior in the context of this idea that oftentimes our behavior is our way of meeting a need in our lives, or our behavior is often in response to consequences that we're experiencing around us. We can kind of begin to put some A and then some B and then some C together. Kind of put behavior together, and we kind of begin to make sense in many ways of human behavior. So human behavior makes sense. Number three, but human behavior is always happening. For whatever reason, back in the Freudian days, there was all kinds of confusion about really what kind of constituted human behavior. And what is behavior? Well, human behavior is what we say, it's what we do, and it's what we think. And we're always doing it. Human behavior is always happening. So this theory takes what's called a positive view of human behavior. Now, positive does not mean good. Positive means always there. A positive view of human behavior. Even when you and I are sitting on the couch doing nothing, we're doing something behaviorally. Even when you ask a friend of yours and you ask them, "Hey, what'd you do in class last night?" and your friend says nothing. We talk oftentimes in that kind of language where it gives the impression that it's possible for us to do nothing. This theory says there's not that's we cannot not act. We're always doing something. And so this idea of behavior is always happening. This is a theory that it emphasizes outward observable behavior. It de-emphasizes emotions and labels. Now, our feelings are very important, but this theory is less interested in how we feel and more interested in what we are doing. So, and we oftentimes utilize it when we work with people in counseling. Oftentimes, as a counselor, I want to know how people are feeling. I want to understand through empathy, their emotional experience. But oftentimes, I'm less interested in what they're feeling. I'm more interested in what they're doing and what they want to do. What's something that you can do? What do you want to do? Not think, not feel. What do you want to do about that? Something concrete, something that you can work on, that we can kind of look at and see how it's kind of going and kind of track like some progress. We do that all the time in counseling. That's what we call more of a behavioral approach. And that kind of comes out of this idea. So a de-emphasis on emotions and feelings, again, does not mean that the emotions and feelings are not important, but a de-emphasis on that. And then also a de-emphasis on labels. Now, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that oftentimes as we have conversations about our behavior, we oftentimes use labels to refer to our behavior. So we'll say he's lazy, or he's controlling, or she's perfectionistic, or she, or whatever. All these different labels that we use. The problem with labels is they're not clear. And so behavior theory came along and said, you know what? Although we often use labels to refer to behavior, there's nothing wrong with that. We're not interested in labels. We're interested in specific behavior, physical, verbal, and cognitive. Specifically, what are people doing or not doing? We're not interested in labels. Labels are often negative. They're often confusing. They're often subjective. And so it's hard. And so this is sort of an approach to counseling that's kind of more concrete and kind of black and white. Those of you in the room who are kind of concrete black and white thinkers, you like behavior theory probably because, again, it's not as focused on the gray, it's more on the black and white. And sometimes that's helpful for us as we help people. So de-emphasis on labels and on feelings. The idea that behavior results in consequences. I have a lot of information in this module about consequences, that oftentimes when we act, our behavior results in something. We don't live in a vacuum. And so our behavior has an influence and an impact on the world around us. And when we act, we experience consequences. An old school central idea of behavior theory, the idea that behavior results in consequences. That's idea number one. And then here's this idea. And the consequences that we experience often influence what we do next behaviorally. So behavior results in consequences. It's twofold. Behavior results in consequences. And I give you some information about different forms, for example, of consequences in the module this week. But not only does behavior result in consequences, the consequences that I experience when I act often influence what I do next. So it's a two-way, we call a reciprocal relationship. The idea of behavior and consequences. I act, something happens as a result of my behavior. And that consequence that I experience often influences what I do next. So, this two-way street relationship between behavior and consequences. So, I give you some information about consequences. I also give you some real basic information about reinforcement and punishment. So, you're probably familiar with those terms, the idea of positive reinforcement and punishment and those kinds of things. Those terms come right out of this theory, reinforcement and punishment. So I give you a really, really simple definition of reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement and punishment have to do with consequences. So you can't talk about behavior and consequences and not talk about reinforcement and punishment. The reality that sometimes the consequences that we experience strengthen our behavior. Sometimes the consequences that we experience when we act, those consequences have an effect on our behavior in that it strengthens our behavior. It's called reinforcement. Other times, though, not every single consequence we experience reinforces our behavior. Other consequences punish our behavior. And what that means is that sometimes the consequences that we experience when we act have the effect that they weaken or lessen our behavior. That's called punishment. So I give you some real basic, simple definitions of reinforcement and punishment in the conversation on consequences in our module this week. So really, really simple. My experience with behavior theory, there may be, for example, the theory we just got done talking about, Gestalt therapy. It was possible, maybe as we worked through Gestalt therapy, that maybe there were times where you were like, okay, I think I understand this. I'm not sure exactly what they're talking about here. That's hardly ever the case with behavior theory. Behavior theory is real straightforward, and it's something that all of us can connect to because all of us know about behavior because we all engage in it. You're engaging in it right now as you're listening to me. I'm engaging in it right now as I'm talking to you. We all know about behavior. We all know about human behavior, so it's something we can all kind of connect to. And so I like to cover behavior theory in this class quickly to give you a little introduction. We'll talk some more about it next week in module number 10. And then many of you will be with me, if you're not already with me, in the behavior mod class, where we get a little bit deeper into some of the things we've just talked about. So look at your lecture notes for the week. Go through and look at the textbook reading. Do your discussion question. As always, you're doing awesome on those. Do your homework. You're also doing awesome on that. Come back next week and we'll talk a little bit about some applications of behavior theory out there in the real world. I will see you then.